I walked into my house holding a letter that said I'd just inherited $8 million from a grandmother I never knew had that kind of money. My husband had left something waiting for me on the kitchen table, too. A manila envelope, and signed, with the words divorce petition printed clearly across the top page. I stood there holding both pieces of paper, one in each hand, understanding almost nothing except that the biggest day of my life had just collided with the worst one. Patrick walked in 20 minutes later and found me still standing at that table. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," he said, glancing at the envelope, not at me. He had no idea what I was holding in my other hand, or how differently this conversation was about to go than the one he'd clearly been planning. Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice and karma always collects its debt. My name is Naomi Sutton. I'm 34. Patrick and I had been married for 7 years, and for most of that time, I believed we were simply going through a rough patch that every long marriage hits eventually, the kind where conversations get shorter and weekends start feeling like separate schedules instead of shared time. I didn't know, standing in that kitchen, that Patrick had already filed for divorce 3 weeks earlier, quietly, without telling me, timing the papers to arrive on our attorney's standard delivery schedule, the same week my grandmother's estate lawyer had scheduled to call me about her will. We'd built a modest, comfortable life together in that house, a life I genuinely thought was steady, if a little worn around the edges the way most 7-year marriages are. It started small enough that I told myself it was simply stress. About 4 months earlier, Patrick started working later, missing dinner 2 or 3 nights a week, always with a reasonable explanation about deadlines at his firm. I believed him, since he'd always been genuinely hardworking, and I had no reason yet to think otherwise. 2 months after that, I noticed he'd stopped wearing his wedding ring during his workouts, telling me once, casually, that it bothered his hand at the gym. I let that go too, telling myself I was reading too much into something small, though a small, quiet part of me noted it anyway, the way you notice a crack in a wall without yet worrying about the ceiling. Looking back, I remember noticing his phone face down more often that spring, a habit that had never bothered him before, but I told myself everyone gets a little more private sometimes. I lost real ground during those months, without understanding why. I stopped planning our anniversary trip that spring, since Patrick kept saying work made travel impossible right now. I missed noticing how rarely he touched my shoulder anymore, how our conversations had shrunk down to logistics, groceries, bills, whose turn it was to walk the dog. I told myself this was simply what marriage looked like after 7 years, and I never once considered he might already be planning his exit. My sister asked me once, over coffee that same spring, whether Patrick and I were doing all right, and I remember laughing it off, telling her we were just busy, the way I'd told myself the same thing more times than I could count. My grandmother, Vivian, passed away 2 months before that day in the kitchen. I knew she'd lived modestly for decades, running a small antique shop most of her life, and I had no reason to expect anything beyond a few sentimental keepsakes from her estate. If you've ever had the best news of your life arrive on the exact same day as the worst, tell me in the comments, because I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived through that. "You weren't supposed to see that yet," Patrick said again, standing in the kitchen doorway, still not quite looking at me. "Why are you filing for divorce?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. He hesitated, then said it plainly. "I've been seeing someone, Naomi. Her name's Stacy. I think it's time we're both honest about where things actually are." I didn't tell him about the letter still folded in my other hand. Something in me, some instinct I couldn't quite name, told me to wait. "Okay," I said. "Let's talk to lawyers then." I called my grandmother's estate attorney the next morning, a careful, precise woman named Renata Kim, who had also handled a small trust of her own for my family years earlier. "Naomi, I want to walk you through the timing very carefully," Renata said, once I explained what had happened. "Your grandmother's trust technically transferred to you upon her passing, but the formal distribution, the actual funds landing in an account under your name, is scheduled for next month. Combined with the fact that your husband filed for divorce 3 weeks before either of us learned the estate's true value, this inheritance may fall entirely outside the marital assets subject to division." She paused before adding, "I'll be honest, Naomi, Timing like this is rare. Most people don't get this clean a separation between the two events. You should feel no obligation to volunteer information he never asked for honestly himself. Meaning what exactly? I asked. Meaning if this stays quiet until the divorce is finalized, Renata said, there's a strong legal argument that Patrick has no claim to any part of it. I didn't tell Patrick anything about the inheritance. I let the divorce proceed on his terms, moving quickly, since he clearly wanted to finalize things before Stacy, as I later learned, was already several months along in a pregnancy neither of us knew about at the time. Renata handled the paperwork on my end with a quiet efficiency I was grateful for, since I genuinely didn't have the energy to fight over furniture or bank accounts I no longer cared much about keeping. It was during the 4th week of proceedings that I overheard Patrick, through a voicemail he accidentally left on my old phone instead of Stacy's, talking about finally starting fresh once the divorce cleared, mentioning offhand that he assumed I'd walk away with basically nothing worth splitting anyway, since we never had much. He had no idea exactly how wrong that assumption actually was. I sat on the edge of my bed after hearing that voicemail, replaying it twice, feeling something settle in me that was closer to resolve than anger. I didn't correct him. I let Renata quietly finalize the trust distribution the same week the divorce settlement was being drafted, structured entirely under my name alone, completed the day after the divorce became official, exactly as Renata had carefully planned it. Patrick and Stacy married 2 months later, a small courthouse ceremony I heard about secondhand through a mutual friend, the same friend who'd once been Patrick's college roommate and still felt awkward, months later, about which side of the split he was supposed to land on. It was around that same time that my grandmother's estate made local news, since it turned out Vivian's small antique shop had quietly held a collection of rare furniture and art pieces for decades, appraised, after her passing, at a value far beyond what anyone in our family had ever imagined. A regional auction house had apparently been trying to reach her for years about several pieces she'd never once mentioned to any of us, letters she'd simply filed away in a drawer, uninterested in selling something she considered part of her own history rather than an investment. The same haste Patrick used to leave our marriage quickly, before either of us fully understood what my grandmother's estate actually held, ended up costing him the one thing he never realized he was walking away from. Patrick called me once, about 3 weeks after the story ran in the local paper, his voice carrying a strange, careful tone I'd never quite heard from him before. "Naomi, I saw the article," he said. "I had no idea. If I'd known." "You didn't know?" I said. That was the point. That first call wasn't the last. Patrick called again 2 months later, this time asking, carefully, whether I'd consider helping each other out, since the antique shop's new museum wing had made local headlines a second time, and he and Stacy, he admitted, were struggling more than he wanted to say out loud. I told him I wished him well, and left it there. By the following spring, Patrick's marriage to Stacy had visibly strained under pressure neither of them had planned for, a baby, a smaller apartment than either of them expected, and a lingering resentment I heard about only secondhand, through the same old college roommate who still felt caught between us. Patrick called a 3rd time that summer, this time asking outright if there was any way I'd reconsider things between us, telling me he'd made the worst mistake of his life, leaving so quickly, without ever really knowing what he was walking away from. "Patrick," I said, "you didn't leave because of what I had. You left because of who you already were. That part hasn't changed just because the numbers did." He didn't call again after that. I heard, much later, that he and Stacy separated within the year, and that Patrick had taken a second job to cover child support, still working the same long hours he once used as an excuse for missing our anniversary, except now there was no fortune waiting quietly on the other side of any of it. I didn't feel triumphant hearing any of that. Mostly, I felt a strange kind of clarity, understanding fully, for the first time, that Patrick had left a marriage he assumed had nothing left worth staying for, without ever once asking me what I actually had, or might one day have. Whatever regret he carries now, he carries alone, since I was never willing to become the safety net for a decision he made, without me in the room. I used part of the inheritance to expand my grandmother's old shop into a small museum space honoring local craftsmanship, something Vivian had talked about wanting to do for years, but never had the resources to attempt. I hired 2 of her former employees, both of whom had worked alongside her for over a decade, to help run it, and I set aside a portion of the trust to fund small scholarships for local trade students, something I know she would have loved more than any headline about the value of her collection. I still think about that afternoon sometimes, standing in my kitchen holding 2 envelopes, one containing the best news of my life, the other containing the end of a marriage I thought I understood. Patrick walked away that day certain he was leaving nothing behind worth noticing. He had no idea, standing in that doorway, exactly how much he was actually giving up. My grandmother used to tell me that patience was the one inheritance she could guarantee every single one of us. Long before any of us understood, she meant it quite so literally. If you've ever had to quietly protect what was yours instead of announcing it before you understood the full picture, you already know it works better that way. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell me down below what you would have done standing at that kitchen table.